series this semester. We'll start again in February in the spring semester. So watch for events, and if you get on our list, we'll send them right to your inbox. Today it's really my pleasure to introduce Alberto Hernandez Lemus. He's Associate Professor of Philosophy at Colorado College. He's the author of many articles, including Deleuze and Italian Neorealism and Performance Activism at the Borderlands. He's also recently back from Brazil and meeting with all kinds of different social movements, groups, including the Landless Peoples Movement. Is that true? Oh, that's true so far. Wow. Yeah? Okay. So I'll be curious to see if that's impacted the paper he's presenting us today, which is Philosophical Reflections on Latin American Philosophy today. So please help me welcome Alberto Hernandez.
Thank you very much. I'm very, very happy to be here. I have a little handout that I'd like to pass around. Well, it's first of all, it's great to see friends, to gather around the table to talk about issues. So I'm really looking forward to your comments and your questions. The handout is nothing but just a little cheat sheet of some of the names I will be dropping, so that you kind of follow a little bit the pedigree or of the authors that I would be engaging. The main book that I will be discussing is one written by Gianni Vattimo and Santiago Zavala. Gianni Vattimo belongs in that tradition of hermeneutical thinking, beginning with Heidegger, Gadamer, Hannah Arendt, and he, in addition to being a philosopher, he's also a politician. He has been engaged as a member of the European Parliament, as a member of the different conglomerations of European parties, most of them left, well, all of them left, with different names. So for example, the Communist League, etc., have been kind of his affiliations, and he continues to be active in the European Parliament. He has taught in the United States in many universities, and I've encountered him at Colorado College when I was a student there many years ago, and then also at the New School for Social Research when I was getting my doctorate degree there. Santiago Zavala is a researcher, a philosopher as well. He is a writer for Al Jazeera, and he is a researcher at the University of Barcelona. All the other names will be more or less relevant. The other name that I think is important is Rainer Schürmann, who was also one of my professors at the New School, whose work will be discussed here. But I really think that the essay will kind of familiarize you, will make it easy to become familiar with some of the themes that I find relevant for this discussion. So I will just read the paper. Will take more or less 35 minutes or so, and then I'm eager to hear your questions on your feedback. So the starting point of this essay is the work by Gianni Vattimo and Santiago Zavala entitled Hermeneutic Communism. And here I would like to ask you to, every time that I mention the word communism, to put quotes before and after. Communism will have to be understood with a very, very low case C, and not to be associated with any kind of Soviet model. So the starting point of this essay is the work of Vattimo and Zavala entitled Hermeneutic Communism. My aim is to seriously consider the good intentions behind their provocative project. At the same time, I want to push those intentions to a conceptual realm which is off limits to thinkers who are committed, as I believe they are, to some sacrosanct figures of exactly the Western metaphysical liberalism they seek to criticize. Gianni Vattimo is famous for a concept called pensiero debole, weak thought, which criticizes that kind of hardcore objectivity. So in a nutshell, Vatima and Zavala engage in a performative contradiction when they conflate the notion of anarchy, which they consider a kind of hermeneutics, with the state policies of so-called progressive South American governments, which they called communists, at least in spirit. And here they have in mind governments such as that of Brazil, Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador. There is a lot to be salvaged from this contradiction, however, as I will engage to demonstrate in what follows. By far, their greatest contributions are twofold. First, their reappropriation of Rainer Schurman's interpretation of Heidegger's thought as a kind of anarchic hermeneutics. And secondly, their effort to theorize the important political ramifications of that philosophical stance, which they refer to as hermeneutic communism. Similarly, the greatest blindness in the work of Vatima and Zavala is emblematic of many well-intentioned interpreters of today's complex reality, whose hopes for the construction of what Vatima and Zavala call weak communism, after weak thought, pensiero debole, is placed in the work of political parties and national governments. I will contend that the truly weak and truly communist projects taking shape in Latin America today are being carried out outside of those state and party structures. As I will argue, the mandate obtained by governments, even through democratic elections, sets in motion a series of centripetal forces whereby the horizontality and immanence of grassroots social movements is subsumed under the vertical and transcendental logic of the state, no matter how progressive its intentions. The result amounts to an institutionalization and bureaucratization of those movements, by which they are transformed from social movements to social organizations. In order to make this last criticism clear, I may resort to Foucault's distinction between the concept of government and governability. Ultimately, I will argue, even those social movements to whose organization and groundswell of mass support progressive governments of Latin America owe their electoral victories must be governed and managed. I will propose that we take a look at some of the essential characteristics that are lost in the accommodation of these movements from horizontal to vertical democracy, from delegated to representative authority, from autonomy to clientelism, when not plain co-optation. These are some of the devices or tools that constitute the ability to govern the loose and massive associations which constitute a social movement. In many ways, to govern means to subsume under the logic of the state, the reason of state, which bears an uncanny family resemblance with the type of metaphysical closure that Vatimo's concept of pensiero debole, weak thought, defines itself against. However, a truly anarchic wave is happening in Latin America and elsewhere right now before our eyes. This wave can no longer be described as a collection of social movements, but must be seen as a veritable societies in movement, as the Uruguayan author Raúl Cibechi has argued. We are bound to overlook this groundswell when we limit our analysis to the doings of states and interstate transactions. Just as the permeability of states can be demonstrated by their vulnerability to capital flows, one would need to listen to the echoes of like-minded social movements ringing across national boundaries. These larger cross-border tendencies are bypassing their local states as reluctant recipients of the demands of the active participants in those movements. Because for many of today's social movements, it is no longer a question of addressing demands to any given state or party institution. Their anarchic roots reach much more deeply. It is a question of actively seizing or defending territories whereupon to construct truly anarchic, that is, non-hierarchical forms of social cooperation worthy of the name communist, and aimed at self-help in areas of sustainable production and reproduction of traditional and new forms of life. education, and health. The essay is broken up in 3 sections. The first is description versus hermeneutics. The second is what is communism? And the third, territories outside state structures. So first, description versus hermeneutics. Vattimo and Zavala speak of hermeneutics as a contrast and corrective to the official program of truth-oriented science and philosophy, which is hegemonic in our globalized world. Truth-oriented philosophy, which following Heidegger they associate with metaphysics, claims accuracy in the description of real states of affairs, independent of the act of observation and interpretation. For hermeneutics, by contrast, any pretension to truthfulness is necessarily weak. It would need to go beyond the description of a state of affairs and begin by focusing on the intersection among a constellation of participants in an interpretive event taking place in a specific historical context. For Vattimo, hermeneutics involves what he calls weak thought, or pensiero debole, which is, quote, a strong theory aimed at weakening absolutes, end of quote, such as the belief in objectivity. The claim to truth, to a universal code or norm by which to access truth, has undergone a series of epochal transformations in the history of Western metaphysics. So according to Rainer Schurman, quote, Western metaphysics becomes a succession of epochal principles that determine hegemonically the different periods of the history of thought. When an epoch changes, a new principle installs itself hegemonically in order to legitimate new practices. End of quote. Thus, for Vattimo and Zavala, recognizing the sequence of dominant paradigms and their corresponding hegemonic arche principle has important existential implications, since it reveals the historical relativity of foundations and the lack of a universal supra-historical one. This existential condition is what Lyotard refers to as the postmodern condition, which demands that we become, quote, unaccustomed to living according to legitimations and grounding values, end of quote. End of quote. Following Lyotard, Vattimo and Zavala derive the following consequences of the postmodern condition for political action. Quote, politics cannot be based on accurate representations of reality, but rather on singular, different events that cannot be represented by rational theory. End of quote. What follows from this claim is that the terms politics can be defined as a Nietzschean struggle for the acceptance of one's own interpretation of so-called facts and reality that are up for grabs. Citing Wittgenstein, they draw the conclusion that to politically intervene in a given reality, one must alter the rules of the game, of the language game, shaping and constituting that reality. As a final authority to bolster their case regarding the practical political usefulness of postmodern hermeneutics, Vattimo and Zavala bring in Richard Rorty, for whom no ultimate reality legitimizes or grounds our practices, but only the agreement of an epistemic community engaging in ongoing substantial conversation. Thus, the preference of one interpretation over another will not depend on its greater objectivity, but rather on a recollection of its premises. The question, how did we get here? That is, an analysis of the history that produced such an account of reality. The weak thought that our authors advocate, therefore, does not amount to absolute relativism. Far from it. Weak thought is an interpretive tool which, given its suspicions of the grand narratives promoted by the winners of history, whose histories have become by turns official and hegemonic, is particularly suited to the critical interpretation of the weak and the poor. The weak and the poor are categories that they used to refer to the discharges of capitalism, those inhabitants of the world who do not partake of the unevenly distributed riches extracted from labor and nature. The concept of the poor has, I believe, on purpose, a decidedly Catholic inflection reminiscent of liberation theology. Importantly to say also, Vatimon, publicly acknowledges himself to be a Catholic thinker, proud to acknowledge Nietzsche's dictum that God is dead. For him, to be a Catholic and to accept that is no big deal. Thus far, I have been reproducing Vatimon. Thus far, I have been reproducing Vatimon and Zavala's argument in favor of hermeneutics as an important political tool to intervene against the supremacy of hegemonic interpretations of the world, such as the current Washington consensus, imposed by what they call the winners of history. Under this category, one should not merely understand the select group of nations, such as the G7 or G8, but also the local elites of even the most impoverished countries who subscribe to that interpretation and benefit from the material, economic, and military means with which that interpretation is anchored and deployed to squelch alternative interpretations and alternative political, that is, distributive projects. Before moving on to discuss what these authors have in mind by the provocative coupling of hermeneutic communism, which I will explain in the following section, I will point to what I consider a series of missed opportunities for a much more radical application of hermeneutics as a tool to intervene in reality today. Provocatively, hermeneutic communism begins with a quote from Heidegger's essay, Kant's Thesis About Being, where Heidegger refers to Marx's thesis on Feuerbach, in which Marx famously pleads for philosophy to stop interpreting the world and begin changing it. Heidegger retorts, and Vatimon and Zavala agree, that before any practical change can take place, a change of thought, a new way of interpreting must happen. The very last paragraph of the book returns to this theme. In talking about the power of mass movements in Latin America against oppressive institutions, they warn, quote, "These mass movements might avoid falling back into their practical inert, which is the natural consequence of these revolutions entrusted to small and inevitably violent avant-garde intellectuals. That is, those who have only described the world in various ways. The moment now has arrived to interpret the world." So here they are being critical of these social movements, which they associate with a particular violent revolutionary agenda. My main critique of their proposal is that in their praise of the communist policies of progressive Latin American governments today, Vatimon and Zavala seem oblivious to the fact that their own interpretations are standing on the ground of the paradigm which serves as firmest foundation for the project of modernity since the Peace of Westphalia of 1648, under whose epistemic spell we continue to live, that is, the institution of the nation-state. Even more radically than the dominance of neoliberalism and the Washington Consensus, the paradigm of the nation-state is the universal in need of deconstruction. And that's my take or my critique. Were we to follow their recommendation to conduct a thorough recollection, that is a reinterpretation, only this time directed at the premises and the history that produced the institution of the nation-state, we would soon find that its legitimacy, which according to the classic founders of liberalism, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, is based on the will of the people, precisely begs the question regarding interpretation. How is the will of the people to be interpreted? Is the casting of a ballot every few years sufficient to transmit a mandate regarding policies that affect the everyday lives of the electorate? How representative is representative democracy? And by the way, happy 4th of November. I just read in the New York Times, this is the most expensive midterm election and the one that has the lowest degree of citizens' interest.
Great.
Is the food for thought? Neither here nor there. Is the system of electoral democracy not set up for clientelism? Are there not myriad built-in incentives for the enshrining of a distinctly political class? Is that political class not guaranteed to fall into a conflict of interests between its own welfare and that of the rest of society, whose very acquiescence legitimates the bureaucratic apparatus? Is that acquiescence not much more a tacit, that is, passive consent than an actual expression of desire, in the sense of Spinoza, but also in that of Machiavelli, of the discourses? As the tragic case of the Aymara indigenous social movements in Bolivia demonstrates, representative democracy makes it nigh impossible for grassroots organizations to maintain their specificity and difference in the face of the subsuming force of the state, even when it is their indigenous candidate who has been elected. A truly radical hermeneutics, I contend, would have to question the legitimacy of the nation state without regard to the expediency of keeping the myth in place for the sake of order and continuity. What would happen if we were to simply withdraw our acquiescence and with the candor of a child straightforwardly declared the fact that the emperor has no clothes? This is one, and by far not the principal, aim of La Otra Campaña, the other campaign, the hermeneutic program launched as an invitation by the Zapatistas of Chiapas to the collection of thousands of civil society movements active in Mexico. And that's something that they released when they released the 6th declaration of the Lacandona Jungle. Short of calling for an all-out boycott of Mexican elections, La Otra Campaña calls for an epistemic shift, a shift of focus, to pay attention to the work of organization as well as self and mutual help happening within Mexican civil society, independent of state structures. In the process, La Otra Campaña has made clear that even our following with interest the vagaries of the campaigns orchestrated by political parties for mediated consumption confers legitimacy to a pageant in which the myth of the social contract is reenacted. Under the expedient of choosing between the lesser of two evils, sounds familiar, a series of concessions is extracted from social movements, which often amounts to their political disarticulation. Politics, after all, is conflict. In the third section of the essay, I will focus on the specific issues pertaining to the tortuous relationship between progressive social movements and progressive governments after the elections. For now, I will simply insist on the need to expose the grand narrative which traces supporting the belief in the legitimacy of the nation state to expression of the will of the people. This is the myth that a rigorous and consistent radical hermeneutics cannot avoid. So, for example, to follow the Wittgensteinian proposition that Vatimo and Zavala themselves bring up, a valid move to intervene and subvert the existent language of electoral representative democracy would be simply for a mass of citizens to resist the appeal by the voting machinery to participate in this expensive charade, or even to dignify its questionable legitimacy by paying attention to it. This move, not contemplated in the prevalent rules of the game, can contribute to a paradigm shift of profound consequences for a long overdue rethinking of the means of the sacrosanct term democracy. Section 2. What is communism? What do Vatimo and Zavala understand by this term in the title of their book? Above all, for them, communism is an interpretive practice in a relationship of critique to capitalism. Here, they endorse the definition given by Eric Hobsbawm, which I quote at length. Communism is a critique of capitalism, critique of an unjust society that is developing its own contradictions. The ideal of a society with more equality, freedom and fraternity. The passion of political action, the recognition of the necessity of common actions, the defense of the causes of the poorest and oppressed. This does not mean anymore a social order such as the Soviet one, an economic order of total organization and collectivity. I believe this experiment failed. Communism as motivation is still valid, but not as a program. And this is the end of quote by Eric Hobsbawm. Consonant with Hofstraum's assessment, our authors reject any, quote, political plan wherein objective truth ought to guarantee results. End of quote. Here again, they disqualify as non-hermeneutic any so-called communist program which enshrines an arche as a, quote, unique imposed truth and compulsory orthodoxy, end of quote. Their conception of communism is thus utopic. That is, it must remain aspirational and defy closure. It must remain unrealizable as a finished product once and for all. Beware, they say, of, quote, the revolution considered completed. It is then that it becomes despotic power, hegemony, and violence against any disclosure towards a different future, end of quote. Hegemonic orthodoxy comes in many guises, right? So, above all, for Vattimo and Zavala, communism puts an emphasis on the fluidity of the construction of collective subjectivities in a context of fraternal love. Quote, now that God is dead, they suggest, and the absolute truth is not credible anymore, love for the others is possible and necessary. End of quote. A critique of the limitations of hermeneutic communism is here called for. According to our authors, the framed industrial democracies, and notice here the reference to Heidegger's Gestell, right, in framing, you know, so in the word framed industrial democracies of the West are caught in an impasse. Quote, while the parliamentary majorities are following a right-wing conservative course, European social movements follow with hope the socialist renovation of South America, where the new South American governments have demonstrated communist access to power may still take place within the framework of the formal rules of democracy, end of quote. And here, of course, they're talking about the wave of electoral victories in European elections, including in the European Parliament. Vattimo and Zavala take for granted the social movements whose support has made possible the electoral triumph of the progressive governments they praise. Chavez, Morales, Lugo, Lula. Either naively or lazily, in my view, they fail to practice a properly hermeneutical recollection of the historical premises that gave rise to those governments. Their faith in the representative accuracy in the transmission of collective subjectivities in the form of a presidential mandate causes them to neglect the following questions. Where and how are those collective subjectivities being constructed? In what way are the desires of the multitude being expressed? Returning now to the weakened and unprogrammatic version of communism that Vattimo and Zavala embrace in Hobsbawm's formulation, we recognize the list as an expression of human desires rather than government policies. Hobsbawm speaks of equality, freedom, fraternity, the passion of political action, the recognition of the necessity for common actions, the defense of the causes of the poorest and oppressed. The problem with our authors, and this is an issue that today's social movements are urgently debating, is that there is no guarantee that those collective desires will find adequate transmission and translation to reach the highest echelons of policymaking, which by default is an attribution of the state. At the root of the matter is the very notion of political representation. Vattimo and Zavala assume the role of the state as fosterer of desires and dispenser of the conditions in which those desires will thrive. This begs the question, where and how are those desires being generated? A sober look at the conditions on the ground, which made possible the electoral triumph of leftist governments in Latin America in the decade from 2002 to the present, Argentina, Ecuador, Venezuela, Bolivia, Paraguay, and Brazil, to a lesser degree, reveals that the social movements which mobilized for the elections were much more than vote machines. These were massive social movements fighting mostly for land and work, which saw in these leftist candidates possible allies. for the piqueteros of Argentina, the landless peasants movements in Brazil, or even the coca leaf workers who supported Evo Morales in Bolivia, putting their man in the presidential palace, while desirable, was far from being their raison d'etre. Furthermore, it represents the delicate challenge of continuing to press for demands from governments which, though considered friendly by these groups, are beholden to other powerful interests. Multinationals, foreign governments, lending institutions, large landholders, and the military, always looming, to which they constantly need to accommodate. The case of Bolivia today is exemplary. Morales' party, Movimiento al Socialismo, for all of its rhetoric, is engaged in politics that follow the prescriptions for a structural adjustment or poverty alleviation programs promoted by the World Bank, an accumulation of federal reserves by means of modest increases in royalties from its booming gas and mineral extraction, many of which are still in the hands of multinational energy conglomerates. And here it's interesting to talk about, even in spite of the nationalization of the oil industry in Bolivia. And by international conglomerates, we are talking about Petrobras, for example, which is now one of the hegemonic companies, right, by the neighbor Brazil. So it's all fairly complex. Merely symbolic improvement. It's just continuing the list of issues that I have with the policies of Bolivia, even under Evo Morales. Merely symbolic improvement in social expenditures. Development policies focused on infrastructure at the service of the extraction industry, whose booming production is being exported at record levels as raw materials. Indeed, under the watch of many of these progressive governments, we are witnessing a scandalous and systematic re-primarization, not only of Bolivia's economy, but throughout Latin America. And here, primarization is going back to that primary industry, which is extraction, right? Canada has moved into Latin America and expanded amazingly. And by Canada, I mean Canadian companies. Its beneficiaries are multinational corporations and their stockholders, which often include members of the local elites. Paradoxically, in spite of the tense relationship between these social organizations and the Morales government, several popular groups have vowed to stand up in defense of Evo Morales in the event that a threatened coup by the local elites with the not so covert support of the United States might happen. And here I'm just going to go through a list of all these recent coups, white glove coups that we have witnessed. In Honduras in 2010, in Ecuador attempts in 2011, and in Paraguay a success in 2012. The prospect of a domino effect of such coups gains likelihood in the context of the growing presence of United States military bases in the region, Honduras, Colombia, Chile, Argentina, Paraguay, as well as the thinly disguised joint military programs euphemistically called programs for humanitarian readiness, being promoted by the Obama administration. So if the concept of communism that our authors embrace points to an assemblage of human desires, where and under what conditions are such communist desires being generated, nurtured and expressed in Latin America today? In the following section, I will attempt an answer to that question, and this is the last section. Territories outside of state structures, the locus for the construction of new collective subjectivities. According to Baltimore Zavala, quote, the errors and violence of many communist regimes were caused precisely by their failure to consider these aspects of collective subjectivity, which have to be interpreted as mutations of the productive forces, end of quote. While it is clear that in this passage they are referring to governments of the real socialism type, here again, the transcendental bias of our authors shows through. Who is the subject doing the verb interpret in this sentence? I contend, based on the context of their argumentation throughout the book, that it can only be the state, which should be receptive to those collective subjectivities in order to translate them into policies to assist the population. Here I emphasize the telltale verb assist. So the duty of the state is to assist, and the assistentialist state, in the rationally developed and programmed expression of those desires. But this is the same transcendental logic that informs the policies of empowerment, which is the title now used by the World Bank, USAID, and the Inter-American Development Bank. Empowerment or poverty alleviation, they always come with new euphemisms. At the heart of this issue is a vertical transcendental relationship between rulers and ruled. Let us return to the question regarding the where and how of the construction of new Latin American collective subjectivities. We will find that these are happening not only outside of the structures of the state in an abstract way, but even more radically, that many of them are actually taking place in concrete territories outside the reach of the states, that is, in autonomous territories. To begin with, for large sections of the world population living in marginalized rural and urban spaces, the presence of the state is limited to periodic police or military harassment. For the increasing population of the world's inhabitants living in the urban periphery, urbanization and construction services are the product of their own ingenuity and labor. If you visit, in any of the myriad slums, all of that is self-done. It is important to emphasize territorial autonomy, whether formal or de facto, for the construction of new subjectivities. For large segments of the population in Latin America, the concept of citizenship is a mere abstraction that stands in contrast to the much more meaningful sense of belonging to the weave of social relations and localized identities taking shape in specific territories. The revolutionary nature of the projects I have in mind is something that Vatimo and Zavala seem blind to do for more than one reason, which I also ascribe to their transcendental bias. Firstly, for them, revolution means a taking over of state power. Secondly, for them, a revolutionary movement can only access state power by violent means, which involve revolutionary movements in a vicious cycle in which they end up reproducing the violence of the state of affairs they rose up against. This explains their dismissal of Badiou and Negri, for whom in Vatimo and Zavala's interpretation, revolution inevitably entails the violent takeover of state power. We owe to the neo-Zapatista movement of Chiapas their revolutionary realization that a revolution must be neither violent nor seek to topple and replace state power. After 12 days, only 12 days, of military battle against the Mexican government and their paramilitary subcontractors in 1994, their guns have been silent, and the battle for a dignified life within their territories has continued by nothing but non-violent means. But here it is crucial to distinguish between the modern, transcendental and vertical concept that Vatimo and Zavala reject, and the postmodern, immanent and horizontal revolutionary practices that have been theorized by Deleuze, Guattari and Negri, and are being practiced in the slums of Latin America, in the mountains of Chiapas, in the liberated factories of Argentina, in the peace community of San José de Apartado in Colombia, all of them using non-violent weapons to survive a climate of war. Paradoxically, the unprogrammatic and weakened communism that Vatimo and Zavala advocate, minus the state, seems much more consonant with the molecular revolutionary form of communism theorized by Guattari and Negri in their little book, Communists Like Us, originally published as New Spaces of Freedom. For them, quote, communism is the form in which society can be organized after the destruction of the capitalist system, that is, after the destruction of the class system and the system of exploitation, when the organization role of the state as opposed to that of society has been cancelled. End of quote. So notice here they're talking about, you know, the kind of like the messianic after, right, after. And my contention is that many of these forms of organization are happening right now, even consonant with, you know, state apparatus, and not after, you know, that is toppled. I contend that I only have a little bit more. I contend that the experiences of present-day molecular revolutionaries living and working in many liberated square kilometers of Latin America push us to rethink the proposition after in the passage above. Whereas a modern concept of revolution, and of communism for that matter, is profoundly utopian and messianic, and amounts to a postponement after the toppling of the state, today's postmodern communist revolutions amount to the everyday practices of localized manifestations of life. This means non-utopian, but concrete, that is, concretely topical ways in which human desires of the kinds listed by Hobsbawm are being expressed, in the ways in which life is being reconceptualized and reorganized by increasingly more self-aware groups of actors, who identify less and less with the sense of belonging to a nation state, and more see themselves primarily as members of a local community and to a network of like-minded groups. Contrasting with traditional revolutionary socialist programs, the social movements that I have in mind are ideologically weak. That is, the way in which they respond to the challenges of their everyday situations is not the application of a given utopian theory. Importantly, even if from the point of view of traditional leftist or progressive parties, those responses seem improvised and spontaneous, the responses of many present-day social movements involve a great deal of long-range planning and painstaking decision-making processes among their members. The alternative organization of life in several of these communities can be divided in the areas of education, work, and health. I'll just touch on those three and finish. The area of education is key. It takes place in the very process of participation in civic life. Whereas social relations in the state system are compartmentalized in a way that leaves each compartment in the hands of the expert, who dispenses policies to passive recipients, the organization of life in many of the social movements I have been talking about occurs in a holistic fashion, where active participation in the planning and execution of activities contributes to the transformation of passive objects of policies into actual decision-making subjects. This can be seen, for example, in the way in which a street is traced and planned in a slum, and the slums usually are in the most mountainous areas, you know, that are inaccessible to the market. You know, so planning and building a slum is a great example of the kind of education that I have in mind. This reconstitution of the social fabric is a crucial aspect of the educational context. In these social movements, the state school system is often being replaced or supplemented by educational programs run by the communities themselves. The area of health, and here, you know, if we had endless time, I would tell you about, you know, some fabulous educational projects going on in the slums of Bogota. The area of health in which the state has been notoriously neglectful vis-a-vis marginalized communities is an area in which the Zapatista movement and MST, the movement of the landless peasants in Brazil, have been making an effort to invigorate traditional forms of medicine to promote preventive health. The aspect of work, the third category, is a category that makes clear the relationship between life and territory. As the Machiavelli of the discourses makes clear, what the multitude want is merely to live. The consequence of this realization is that more and more, for the growing members of these communities, work involves access to land, and at least space whereupon to produce and reproduce life. This implies a preference for forms of activity in which use value is produced and exchanged without the mediation of market transactions, or rather, without exchange value. The preeminent role of exchange value is deflated and in more and more areas of communal experience. Communal gardens, kitchens, childcare centers, constructions are tangible manifestations of this practical reconceptualization of work. In closing, our hermeneutical program based on the practice of pensiero debole can be a useful tool to keep us on our toes when engaging with contemporary manifestations of the desire of the multitude, as it resists the closing in of the hegemonic forces of the IMF, the World Bank, and World Trade Organizations, even in the best intentioned practices of even the best intentioned progressive governments.
Wow.
Thank you.
Okay, we have time for questions.
I can ask.
Oh, go ahead. No,
Sure.
Yeah, fine.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much. I'm from the University of Denver, so my first time here, first the hosts of the event, of course, for your very insightful, inspiring talk. And I'm very sympathetic to your approach in many ways. I think that we should have actually listened to this talk years ago when some of these leftist parties were coming into power and bringing with them some of the, I'm thinking more specifically, being Brazilian, in the Brazilian case, social movements tied to the state, which saw that, as you said, not as their end game, but as a way to enlarge the reach to the constituencies they were providing, their programs, but became perhaps too tied to the state and too dependent on the funds from the state. And now we see coming to the fourth term of the Workers' Party in Brazil, the challenges of that, right? The over-dependence of social movements, grassroots movements, popular movements on the federal state. And now there's an interesting possibility of a new conversation about how to reframe that connection. But on the other hand, I'd like to be a little provocative to ask, how do you do that? Which is, seems to be you're proposing even a more fundamental conceptual way to rethink beyond the box of the party politics and everything else, at a time when this platform, this agenda is under siege from other forces, right? As we saw now last week in the second round of presidential election in Brazil. So we have the two challenges at the same time. So social movements have to become less dependent on this party politics, on the funds of the state, but at the same time, to resist also the attack from the conservative forces. And I'm sorry, I know I'm narrowing the conversation, and I don't mean to be that, but I would like to go straight to that in a very specific, concrete case. It seems like you have to change the tire where the car is running, right? You have to address that, your conceptions of how you do your policies, but at the same time you have to resist to the traditional opposition. How do we do that?
Well, I mean, it's a dogged question, right? And on a day like today, I mean, when we have the ultimatum, those of us who have not, done our civic duty, you say, well, either I lose that opportunity, or I participate in the electoral process. Yes, it's true that they're all a bunch of crooks, but there are some crooks that are better than the others, So I'm going to, right? I mean, but this is always the case, right? We're always being forced in that in that action, right? As if there is no escape. So I mean, I want to take that very seriously. I see differences between these parties. Like, for example, in the Brazilian case, right? The Workers' Party on the one hand, now going in its fourth term, and the rival Social Democratic Party, completely different platforms in terms of certain social policies. So I mean, it makes your option, well, either I favor this particular platform or this other one. But if we pay attention, you know, kind of like microscopically, you know, to the larger policies that these two groups are pursuing, for the most part, you know, both of them want some kind of a, you know, a continued expansion of primary exploitation of resources, right? The Workers' Party is, you know, perfectly happy with this kind of a model of development that is, you know, in many ways creating a great deal of poverty and alienation, you know. But at the same time, they say, well, but we have this this poverty alleviation program, you know, the Bolsa Familia, for example. And the numbers show that if we define poverty by you know, the United Nations standards, right? What is it now? It's something like $2 per day.
Yeah, it's really low.
Well, now you know, huge numbers are no longer poor by that definition, because they make 250 or 2 or 3, you know, thanks to the Bolsa Familia, these assistentialist programs. I mean, is that really the best we can do? You know, to say, well, to choose the lesser of two evils. Can we think of different ways to focus our attention and our energy? And I see in the case of Brazil, you know, many of these movements, you know, see no contradiction. The children, you know, go to school. The family earns its Bolsa Familia, and they continue to fight for land, you know, in their occupations. I think a good symptom, you know, that shows that there's really very little difference between the Workers' Party and the parties to the right of that. That there is very little difference between them is the fact that since the Workers' Party has been in power, none of these occupations have been recognized. You know, there were more recognitions in the previous governments. You know, and so the Workers' Party, yes, has an agenda that's more palatable, perhaps, you know, to the poor, and you can see that, you know, as you know, who is voting, right? You know, if you go to the GDP areas, you know, that have the greatest GDP, Sao Paulo, you know, and those regions, you know, they're, you know, the opposition won. But, you know, really, they're not rival projects, you know, it's a question of degree, perhaps, you know, and in my view, it's a question of rhetoric. Well, so, you know, what the Zapatistas, you know, would answer to that, give us answer to that question would be, if you want to vote, vote. But don't expect that the change will come through that. That you know. Oh, okay, next one.
Yeah, no. What I was picking up from you is that essentially our modern political theories are couched in references to the 19th century, and we're in the 21st century. And what the Zapatistas are trying to do is, in a sense, they're trying to take that which was marginalized, like things like the anarchist movement, like Emma Goldman was talking about, and it's almost like a re-democratization process, where they're saying, no, these exterior structures can't do a damn thing for you, but you, together with your self-sovereignty and the sovereignty of your community, can make a change, but it's not going to happen from the central authority someplace else.
You
And
know,
it's a global problem. I mean, Brazil's an exemplar, but it's right here in the United States too.
and I think you know, I really take very seriously this suggestion of thinking weakly, you know, a weak thought or a weak form of democracy, to think little, you know, to think small. You know, and I mean, Rousseau put it very, very nicely, right? When in the social contract said that the only way in which a democracy could be run is if people are able to see each other, right? You know, to get to know each other, to have these discussions. The second that you start engaging in representation, you know, the chain of transmission, you know, creates this new class, that would probably, find ways of keeping their own interests first and foremost. Yes.
So, if I understand your point, it's not that only social movements are ideologically weak, but that they should be ideologically weak in order to ultimately perform their function, which is to, at least first, to improve social conditions at a local level.
Yeah.
Okay, granting this, one may still basically press the following worry. Okay, how can we move beyond that? Because though one may ultimately organize within one's community to effect some change, the change is always going to be, in a sense, pitted against institutional structures that are inevitably going to ultimately crush these efforts.
Well, I mean, but I followed you, perfectly until you reached the very last comment that
Right.
ultimately they will be crushed.
Mm-hmm.
But why? I mean, I think that we see that even these actors that are acting locally, right, the small institutions, I mean, the small movements in small territories, are amazingly efficient at communicating with each other and creating networks, of solidarity. That's the only way in which we can explain the fact that the Mexican army or its paramilitaries have not crushed, the territories, in 20 years, and they're alive and well, and in this next month there will be one more of these multitudinary conferences, people from all over the world. I mean, in many ways, I think that capacity to network, is a weapon, to ultimately allow these movements to overcome that natural fatalism, that we have been taught to believe. I mean, I think that's perhaps the greatest tragedy, is that we cannot see beyond the possibility, because they are the ones that have the guns, and they're the ones that have the helicopters, in the case of the Zapatistas, they borrowed helicopters from the U.S. to transport troops, so they have access, they have friends, I mean, but nevertheless, there they are, 20 years. The community that I mentioned in passing, that is very inspiring as well, the peace community of San José de Apartado in the state of Antioquia in Colombia. So I mean, that's a mess, the mess that we are witnessing in Mexico today is what they have had for many years. The drug traffickers, the guerrillas, often involved in drug trafficking as well. The government troops, the paramilitaries, and in the middle of that chaos, that huge constellation of horrible forces, amazingly violent track record. There they are. They've been there for 20 years. It's an archipelago of autonomous territories. They don't participate with any armed actors. They're very poor, but there they are. So it's possible. But at the same time, I understand, of course, the larger question, that where you were going. Okay, but what we want is to transform the world, right? We want there not to be these huge state powers, imposing their particular, violent regime on us.
Right.
Is there a way in which we can somehow join forces so that we can, shift the balance of power so that those bad guys can forever be neutralized? I don't know.
Mhm.
But in the meantime, we see these pockets,
Right.
and I think that's, first, better than nothing, and also it keeps hope alive. Or else you just give up,
Right. Mhm.
Yeah.
Isn't that your argument, excuse me, that if you do try to join forces, if these independent territories, these de facto territories try to join with the state, that's what happens in Brazil. It's like, oh, I'm gonna get elected to power so I can reach more people and do more good, but then that eventually gets subsumed by the hierarchy of the state. So even in opposition to the state, that's what you said at the beginning, right? You start horizontal and you become vertical, and that's the exact problem, right?
Yeah.
That you need to avoid that.
Yeah,
If you try to
and-
join forces, that's what.
So shouldn't
is
even try?
happening.
You shouldn't even try?
I think you should try to join
Right.
forces or try.
Well,
remaining
should we not
independent?
even aspire to reinvent the state, or when we put the state in, it's not gonna work?
Mm.
How about,
I would go
how
with the
about
latter.
smaller
I would go with the
governance
latter.
units? That's
Well,
sort
yeah,
of,
I mean, beautiful, exchange. That's exactly what I constantly wrestle with in my own
Right.
head. But okay, I mean, let's say that what are some of the characteristics of the state? The state claims to itself the monopoly of use of force, right? It claims to represent all kinds of different parties in one single institution. Now, what these individual groups, these islands, are doing is saying, well, we can engage in a solidarity network. We will disagree in some issues and disagree and agree in others, but we will somehow, express our solidarity with each other and helping as much as we can. Is then impossible to think of a stateless state of affairs in which these pockets are articulated, as free-floating molecules, or I don't think it's completely unthinkable. We've had it before, with the collapse of the Roman Empire, for example. Not to say that was great.
Great model.
Right? But I mean, it's thinkable, right? It's thinkable. I mean, the state has, in a way, domesticated us so deeply that we cannot think about the possibility of a stateless era. And in many ways, that has kind of like a function as well, because it allows us to think, well, unless with the state or through the state, there's nothing we can do. And that's exactly, I think, I didn't do justice to your first question, when you say, well, many of these social movements have become dependent on the state. Yes, so in some cases, yes, but if what we have in mind here is the landless peasants movement in Brazil, these are local organizations under one kind of large umbrella that they all have that name, but most of these territories behave autonomously. And so, there are some that completely reject, any intervention of the state. Others that really demand of the state that they bring new, better schools, that they install, computer, classrooms, or smart classrooms, for their kids. There are all kinds of varieties, and so in that case, I think we can also speak of a model of organization. In which the individual localities have a great deal of autonomy, and they have great fights, with each other, like what is the best way, and so I think that is kind of like a possible model to think of autonomous territories that are alive and well in the state of Brazil. and that they're somehow engaging in that pressure for the state to behave in a certain way. So another important thing is to avoid the postponement. To think, okay, once we topple the state, then we really organize. That is messianic. But what can we do today? I mean, it's in the collapse of the state in Argentina, for example, in 2001, all of these factories were being abandoned, and people took them over, and for the most part, they engaged in some kind of a horizontal, running of these factories and bookstores and hotels, 15, 13 years later, it'd be interesting to see, how many of them have preserved that same kind of autonomy. But it is possible. And there, the state didn't quite collapse, but the economy collapsed, and with it, it dragged the state. So the state is not nearly as ubiquitous, in all cases. It comes and goes. Yes.
For example, in Mexico, what happened with the Zapatista movement is that it was isolated, basically. They've been there for, since '94. But the problem is that it is basically television companies, the media, actually make them like bad guys. And I remember when I was a kid, when 2000, when the main political party in there lost the election, and you get like the idea that they were like the bad guys. You get like these people with the mask, and they actually make you feel terrified by them. And then it actually got to the point in which there was a point in which people were thinking that Chiapas was going to become a country, trying to independize from Mexico. And for example, I'm from Mexico. My concern is mostly that the government do shut down attempts from people to try to make this kind of like a small revolution. For example, just like 1 month ago, 43 students disappeared from the government adopted, and there were 3 that confirmed were killed by the cartel involved in this kind of like cartel politics stuff. And so I personally believe from when I experienced my friend, my family, the people that are there, that even though that we may not want to be in a revolution, in a violent revolution, there must be, or at least we should aim to a way in which minimize the power of, for example, some governments, that the government Mexican, like the cartel, the way they disappear people, is just getting out of control. And that's like a big concern for me. For example, how do we minimize that? How do we, even though we don't want to use violent means, how do we respond effectively so we minimize the effect that the government has when they implement those?
Yeah. No, that's one of the. Everyone is aware of those. The case of the 43 students, right, in Mexico, who were commandeering a bus, to take to a demonstration or some sit-in or something like that, and they are disappeared.
Yeah. That's outrageous. Sorry, but like that was outrageous.
So I mean, different hypotheses whether they have been put into a mass grave and then burned or executed. A horrible massacre of the kind that we in Mexico have been witnessing regularly since the collapse of the coke trafficking economy in Colombia and the shift from Colombia to Mexico, on the road to this thriving market of drugs. So, what happened in Colombia is, there was an accommodation reached between politicians and the United States, a series of negotiations, certain heads fell, and the situation more or less got into under control. And then the main road for export of drugs, became Mexico. So what we see in the case of Mexico, we have a strong state presence, and yet a very, very weak state. So that's an interesting proposition. How is that possible? The state is so perfectly, infiltrated, perfectly infiltrated, and or so perfectly complicit, perhaps better, in this whole business, that civil society in Mexico is just at a loss as to where to go.
Right.
It's a Kafkian situation. Right? You cannot go to anyone, with any credibility or legitimacy. So it's a tragic, but from the point of view of an optimist, it's a wonderful opportunity, in the tragedy. So we see, for example, massive mobilizations, in Mexico and and throughout the world in solidarity with the students. But I mean, it's not just with the students, but it's just a situation of those kind of, I hope, one of these culminating situations, and we can say, well, we have to rethink the way in which we are allowing that state presence to dominate every single aspect of our lives, because we all live in fear. I mean, that's something like that happened in Colombia.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Yes.
I also want to thank you for a really nice presentation and provocative set of ideas. And I especially liked the suggestion and the argument that there's a hermeneutic requirement in terms of the need for new ideas and to create these structures that allow new ideas to emerge. And so I think about Occupy and the notion of sort of horizontal organizing and the creation of opportunities for new collective identities to establish themselves as legitimate and meaningful. And that's a really important insight here. And I also like the fact that you mentioned it's not totally relative. They're not out of anywhere, and they're not constructed out of thin air. They're constructed in response to very real experiences. And I want to come back to that in a second. And one of the things that I'm struck by in terms of the next step in your argument is that one of the things that I would argue, or that I would conclude as a result of this observation, that this creation of new collective identities is important and is part of what social movements do, is that the state incorporation of those new collective identities is a motor of history that we see. And so you've been describing progressive states. They're progressive perhaps because of the policies that they adopt and the rhetoric that they adopt, but also I think that they're progressive in a sense because they incorporated those collective identities that were mobilized in previous periods and struggles. And so it's their ability to claim that representation and that incorporation that makes the governments that you mentioned, the Ecuador, Bolivia, Venezuela, Brazil, Argentina perhaps, that's what gives them their progressive character, that they become the governments, the vehicles that bring into the state and into political institutions those collective identities established in that previously open period. Which, then one of the observations is, well, there's a real problem with the state, this vertical and centripetal behavior and requirement of the state that is problematic, because in some ways it puts an end to that openness, that ability to create new collective identities. And that is definitely a problem. I would not cede the state to the right, however. So in other words, we need those progressive states, and we need that incorporation of those collective identities to occur and to continue to occur, because when it doesn't, the right is there. The right is perfectly capable of articulating a program for the state and putting it into place. And so, while I'm favorable to, and I very much support the notion that there are local experiments and there are opportunities outside of the state and to create new identities and new collective actors, I also hesitate to say, well, that means that we need to step away from the state and avoid, because once that happens, the right is perfectly capable of establishing the kind of state that they want.
Yeah, I mean,
You just have one thing, so we need less state or need more democratic state?
Well, so and then this, so here's where I would.
Need more progressives for the
terms of-
state to eat up and everyone become more
Right.
progressive as a whole.
I see this as a perhaps cyclical or at least an iterative process. And so thinking specifically about Latin America, you know, the large moments of creation of collective identities, the movement for, the movement against dictatorship, you know, of the 1970s and 1980s, these were moments of establishment of popular sectors, of working class groups, of actors opposed to dictatorship, and those same groups became the actors that opposed neoliberalism. In those places where parties emerged, where political actors emerged to incorporate those opponents of dictatorship and neoliberalism, that's where we see those progressive states. I think we're now at a new moment, and you're calling for attention to those open spaces and those new collective identities is absolutely right on, because at this moment that struggle against dictatorship and that struggle against neoliberalism has reached its cyclical sort of endpoint. Not because the forces of dictatorship and neoliberalism are gone, but because those progressive governments that came into power, they've run their course. They don't have a new set of identities to incorporate, of collective actors to incorporate. They don't have a new set of ideas to articulate. And so that is where we are right now, and that's why I think that your call for sort of attention to those open spaces and those informal or not yet incorporated identities is really appropriate. I think, you know, the task is, you know, are they incorporated into the next version of the progressive state?
you know,
And that
it's just
is what it is.
the problem, you know, I mean, I think that it would be important, you know, for these groups to maintain, you know, this kind of agonistic, you know, relationship with the state. That's why, you know, the landless peasants movement, you know, at times, you know, appears too much in bed with the government, and at times, you know, in a more kind of like healthy, kind of like feisty, you know, distance. But I think, you know, the state, you know, has amazing power to demobilize groups, you know, and you know, if you read the Mexican Revolution, you know, I mean, you know, Zapata, you know, was, you know, the faction perhaps, you know, that motivated the greatest, you know, well, revolutionary thought, you know, land and freedom, you know, and, you know, access to land, the biggest problem, right, in all of Latin America, access to land, you know, and that was, you know, somehow, you know, incorporated in this happy Mexican family, right? You know, Zapata is a great hero, but they killed him, you know, and hocus pocus, we're all Mexican, we're all revolutionary, right? You know, and then 70 years of that revolutionary party, right? You know, the institutionalized revolutionary party. This is the problem, I think, you know. These social movements need to avoid institutionalization. Right? The second that they go, you know, as I said, to bed with the government, you know, a few key players will receive, you know, very nice jobs, right? You know, and they will be recognized as leaders, and nothing happens. You know, a revolution. I mean, you were not necessarily talking about a revolution necessarily, right? You were talking about the state kind of enriching itself from these social movements, and that's all great, but I think the social movements need to be very, very diffident of too much closeness, you know, to the state. Yeah.
We have time for one more
Hold on.
question, so
That
if we
was-
go to somebody who
Okay,
hasn't
yes,
spoken yet, if that's okay.
Oh, yeah, it's fine.
Thanks a lot for your talk. The short version of my question is, why Heidegger? The longer, the longer version would be, why not Marx? And maybe the very long question would be, it seems to be that, you know, I agree with how you're setting this up between vertical and horizontalism, and we're talking about sovereignty, and when we're talking about sovereignty, we're talking about the modality of law and right, and so these collective subjectivities are formed against a juridical subject, and so they, in a sense, stand outside the state in a different space which is usually defined juridically because the state can't mobilize them because they're not juridical subjects, as kind of individual subjects. And so law and right are the kind of correlates here that operate to incorporate collective subjectivities into state form. And so I'm just wondering, since someone like Marx has such a nice critique of that, I mean, maybe it is in your analysis or implicit in your analysis. Why not mobilize those resources in Marx to give that kind of analysis? You know, shelving the dictatorship of the proletariat, which I think if Marx experienced it, he would definitely question that strategy. But ultimately, the communism you seem to be describing is very much what Marx had in mind as a communism, and not as a particular state of affairs, but as this movement which undermined the contradictions that were created by the juridical and economic order, right?
Yeah.
And so I understand, so that's kind of the background of my question. So I understand Heidegger as a resource in the critique of metaphysics, but I don't understand Heidegger as a resource, and maybe this is my reading of it, and as a resource for a critique of sovereignty, a critique of right and a critique of law. And so I'm just wondering if you could just elaborate on that.
Yeah,
a
well,
bit.
that's a very difficult question. I mean, Heidegger, in a way, is the thinker who begins this, very self-conscious critique of objectivity, right? And critique of this kind of like metaphysical claim, that we can somehow, put ourselves in the presence of this thing and appropriate it, And that's the way in which, for the most part, revolutionaries have spoken. We will, scientific Marxism, right? We will figure out the way in which we can overcome, any kind of deviation from what is inevitable, And so, I mean, I think, without perhaps doing justice to the complexity of what you're asking, Heidegger is an inspiration for these thinkers because they want to critique that hegemonic legitimacy that these principles claim for themselves. And so Schumann, talks about this particular paradigm, the state, becoming the hegemon of a particular era, without which we cannot think anymore. It's somehow, the framework for this particular figure of thought, in a particular era. And so Heidegger's critique of Gestell, this idea of, the framing, is not just, an apparatus, that manifests itself in particular institutions, but also that. It's like a structure of thought by which we cannot escape its dictum, its dictates. And so, I guess, Vatimo's attempt, is to strengthen, that kind of diffidence, and by claiming, in a stronger way, right, to say, okay, let's think weakly, in a weak way, and celebrate that. I don't know, whether, there we would have to, draw a parallel, maybe with between Heidegger's own, career as a card-carrying Nazi, and Vatimo's own, involvement in politics, representing a certain party or a coalition of parties, as if there's no escape from the paradigm, even when you are criticizing it. So,
Right.
well, I mean, this is kind of like inspired by what you said, but not necessarily that I have done justice to it.
Thinker speaker.
Well,